As you know, in just a moment, we're going to have a very distinguished group of developers and analysts and practitioners, academics as well, who will speak to an issue that's been lurking underneath the very important presentations by David and by William, and that is an issue of housing affordability. And that issue has become a serious Tier 1 issue in this country. It's not only an issue for the west side of LA or for San Francisco or New York. It's an issue that is deep. It's relatively geographically ubiquitous. It's found in rural areas as well as urban areas, and it's an issue of serious concern. So what I'd like to do here is to provide a little bit of back and fill, so to speak, with respect to the slides that have been presented. I want to provide some metrics of affordability, and then I want to talk about the implications of lack of affordability, both at the household level and at the level of our metro areas and with respect to metro economic viability. So with no further ado, what you have in this chart is a look at rent burdens by income quintile for the US population. In other words, we're going to divide the US population into 5 groups, into income quintiles, and we're going to look to the share of each of those groups which is rent burdened. The standard definition here in the United States for a rent burdened household is a household that pays more than 30% of its income to housing costs. And then there's another standard called severely rent burdened, and that would be a household that pays in excess of half of its income in housing costs. Now I've plotted here 3 of quintiles of interest. Firstly, the lowest quintile, the quintile that you would expect to be rent burdened, that's a red line. And you can see that virtually all lowest quintile households are rent burdened. That's not a surprise. But what is interesting, and again, these are national figures. These aren't figures for LA or San Francisco. What's interesting here is the slope of the orange line and the slope of the green line post-2000. And you see discrete breaks to the upside in the share of rent-burdened households, not only among lower middle income quintile households, that's the orange line, but actually among middle income quintile households. So you see that there, the share of rent burden has gone up from 10 to 25%, and among lower middle income quintile households from 40 to 60%. If you take the long sweep of the time series and you go all the way back to 1960, you'll see that the share of rent burden households amongst these 3 quintiles of the US population has moved up in a rather startling fashion. Now, one piece of the story with respect to rent burdens, of course, is the story of rising rents. David spoke of this, William as well, and here you see some geographic variation in vacancy rates. You see that across this wide cross-section of metropolitan areas, and not only LA and San Francisco, but Houston, Dallas, Detroit, Seattle, places of this sort, vacancy rates have hovered at or below 4%. These are residential multifamily vacancy rates. Now, we have a concept in economics called the natural rate of unemployment. Ed spoke to that concept a few minutes ago, and what we sort of describe to ourselves as a situation where there's significant upward pressure on wages should the unemployment rate fall below the natural rate. We believe the natural rate, or Ed articulated a natural rate today of about 4.5%. Well, here we have an analog to that concept in the world of residential real estate, where we can talk about the natural rate of vacancy. And the same sort of thought process applies. We would expect upward pressure on rents when vacancy rates fall below their natural or equilibrium level. The point of the slide in front of you is that vacancy rates are at or below their equilibrium level across this cross-section of MSAs in the country, and that means the upward pressures on rents that David showed you in his presentation. You can see that across this vast cross-section of MSAs that upwards to 50% of households with incomes approaching $45,000 are rent burdened. So again, this is not unique to a particular metro area, and the share of rent burdened households is substantial. Now, what you may not appreciate is the fact that affordability constraints are rather common in rural areas as well as urban areas. This is a topic which is rarely discussed, but if you look to the purple pieces of this map of the United States, those are rural areas with disproportionately high rent burdens. And you see those rural areas in New England, you see those rural areas in the Southeast, you see those rural areas in parts of California and the Northwest as well. And that is an entirely different phenomenon. We have high rent burdens in LA and San Francisco because the path of prices or the path of rents has far outpaced the path of income growth. In rural areas, it's an entirely different story. It's a story about the caving of labor markets. It's a story about job exit. It's a story about income decline. It's a story of income contraction in the context of prices which are not rising disproportionately. So this particular chart, I dare say, may have something to do with election results and something to do with a whole array of indicators that are pertinent to rural America that are problematical. Anyway, one way to deal with very low-income renter households is to provide some rental assistance. And what you see in this chart is that the share of very low-income rental households has been rising and rising substantially, while the share of assisted households is relatively flat. So the share of assisted households in this country is roughly flat over many years at about 5 million households, where now those very low-income renter households that could qualify for assistance has risen to roughly 20 million. At the same time, we see not expansion in supply, but contraction of supply of units that were designated as affordable units, units that derive from low-income housing tax credits or from project-based assistance, where the projection, and this is a credible projection based on expiration of some of these subsidies and the like, is we're going to lose upwards to 200,000 affordable units a year nationally owing to expiration of some of these programs. Now, as William alluded to, the situation is even more of concern and more egregious here in California, where a full 1/3 of renters in the state of California are severely rent burdened, meaning they spend more than 50% of their income on rent. And that is obviously a cause of concern. Now, with that as a bit of a laying of the empirical base, a few metrics that relate to affordability, let me talk a little bit about why we're concerned about affordability, both at the household level and at the metropolitan level. And I'm not going to speak in terms of what we economists call causation. I'm rather going to speak about correlation or about association. So I'm not making a causal argument here, but nonetheless, our academic literature is full of correlations that should be taken note of. Firstly, we see high correlations between lack of affordability and high levels of crowding of residential dwellings, and we see doubling up and all sorts of other indications of crowding. Secondarily, we know that when affordability is low, so is spending on other sorts of essentials, notably including food, education, health, and energy, and I'm going to show you some evidence of that momentarily. We also know that lack of affordability is associated with longer commutes, and those longer commutes are reflected in the increased congestion that all of us see on the road. So that as well, and I'll come back to that. We also know that, as William has alluded to, you almost cannot put affordable housing in high land cost areas. So efforts to put scalable affordable housing in coastal LA is not necessarily likely to be successful. at any scale other than sort of symbolic. What that means is that affordable housing goes into low rent areas, and those low rent areas, for the most part, are characterized by disamenities that are problematical. Those disamenities are related to public health, they're related to public safety, they're related to school quality, and all sorts of other things. If you've noted a rather prominent piece in the LA Times recently, that piece spoke about very substantial construction of more affordable units on very cheap pieces of land that were located within 50 feet of some of the busiest freeways in the nation, which in turn is reflected in public health studies that have been done here in Los Angeles in higher rates of respiratory disease amongst children and adults inhabiting those units. So those who can't afford housing are subjected to a whole array of disamenities that are problematical and a cause of concern. And in addition to this, we have also causal research that is suggestive of the fact that those who grow up in neighborhoods of lower quality and in housing units of lower quality have lower long-term job prospects. Now, again, a few pieces of empirical evidence here. This is from a highly reputable source, the Consumer Expenditure Survey put out by the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, showing significantly depressed food, transportation, and healthcare consumption, not to mention lower retirement saving among those who are severely rent burdened. This chart I found to be quite interesting in terms of doubling up and crowding. Some 45% of millennials in the state of California live with their parents. And that's true in Florida, it's true in areas of the Northeast, et cetera. So this lack of affordability is certainly associated with that particular phenomenon, as was described by both William and David. We also know that a third of households facing rent burdens are families with children. So there we're speaking about the incidence of disamenity, be it high crime neighborhood, be it dwellings close to the freeway, be it low quality schools that are imposed on children as a consequence of lack of affordability. Now that's kind of at the household level. What about at the metropolitan level? Well, at the metropolitan level, as we all know, the lack of affordability means longer commutes, and longer commutes mean greater congestion, and that means an externality, so to speak, in all of our commutes that we all face every time we get onto the freeway. We know that households and firms are mobile, and in my line of work, we refer to the broad array of metropolitan areas in the United States as a system of cities. And when some cities become less affordable, there's migration to others, of course, and that is of concern to mayors of San Francisco, LA, et cetera. That's a natural consequence of lack of affordability. And we see government intervention, as we know, predicated on shelter for homeless or with respect to environmental pollutants or elsewhere. Okay, what might we think about in terms of approaches to affordability here? What's mentioned most frequently? Well, the most frequently mentioned issue or methodology to enhance affordability has to do with a local regulatory environment. And this item is mentioned across the aisle. David made note of it today, and that is certainly something that we voted on here in LA most recently. But if we could ease the land use regulatory environment, we could get to densification of development, we could get to inclusionary zoning, we could get to more supply, and more supply will ease those affordability issues. There's also obviously construction of workforce housing. The city of, what's going on here? No signal. Okay. Leave it alone. Okay. The city of Beverly Hills is kind of a poster child for provision of workforce housing for their critical workforce, but provision of workforce housing is just kind of a drop in the bucket. Let me say one other thing. We oftentimes look at transportation infrastructure investment as a way of easing commutes as a way of making our metropolitan areas more efficient, part of the infrastructure investment that Ed discussed earlier. But we can also look at transportation infrastructure investment as a mechanism to ease affordable housing issues. And why is that? Of course, via rapid transit, we can open new supply. And we can open new supply in areas where land costs are low, where affordability can be built into market rate housing. And to the extent that this is rail-based rapid transit, it means that we don't impose externalities on all of us with respect to congestion on freeways and the like. So if there's one thought that I'd like to leave you with, it is this thought to, as a long-term methodology, to begin to think about transportation infrastructure investment as a way of creating proximate affordable housing supply, and this way addressing the needs of this renter burden population, as well as hoping to preserve economic viability in high-cost areas such as Los Angeles. So with that, I will step down and we'll go to the panel.